So I'll just start with introducing the background in Bangalore. So Bangalore's a large and rapidly expanding city in southern India. And HIV infection in Bangalore is concentrated amongst female sex workers, their commercial clients, and men who have sex with men. And just to give you an idea of the prevalence, in 2009, a survey among sex workers found there was about 8% HIV prevalence, and a survey that same year amongst probably higher risk MSM found a prevalence of about 16.5%. There's very low HIV prevalence in the general population in Bangalore. And following previous interventions amongst MSM and sex workers in this area over the last 10 years or so, there's very high reported condom use by both groups, so about 75 to 90% reporting that they always use condoms with their high-risk partners, so that's commercial clients for the sex workers and other male partners for the MSM. But not all of their acts or partnerships are covered by condoms, and particularly both groups report much lower condom use with heterosexual long-term partners. So we were looking at pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, which is an intervention given to HIV-negative individuals who are thought to be at high risk of HIV infection. And we're looking at oral PrEP in this work. And this is currently given as a daily tablet, which contains antiretroviral drugs. There's been a number of trials of PrEP. So amongst MSM, the IPREX trial showed a 44% reduction in HIV incidence amongst those taking PrEP compared to those taking the placebo. There have been a number of trials in different heterosexual populations which have showed widely ranging effect, from no effect at all up to a 75% reduction in HIV incidence. And across all of these trials, it's been found that the efficacy of PrEP is strongly related to drug adherence, so whether people are actually taking the pills. There haven't been any trials in sex workers to date, but there are a number of demonstration projects planned or in progress, including several in India. And this work was done as part of a project supporting preparations for doing demonstration projects in India. So the main question we were asking with this research is what could be the additional impact of providing PrEP for sex workers or MSM in this setting. So this is a concentrated HIV setting where condom use is already quite high. One of the things we're interested in is sort of the relative impact of giving PrEP to sex workers or to MSM. So this slide just summarises some of the key characteristics of these populations which we would expect to affect the impact that PrEP could have for both of them. And I'm showing characteristics just for high-risk MSM here rather than the whole MSM population. So these high-risk MSM are a subset of the MSM in Bangalore who are more likely to be having receptive anal intercourse and having a higher number of partners. And then more likely at the moment to be in contact with current intervention services. So this is the group that would likely be reached with PrEP, at least at the moment. So just running quickly through the different characteristics, you can see the MSM population is a bit bigger than the sex worker population, and they report somewhat lower condom use than the sex workers do and have a higher HIV prevalence. But the sex workers have a very large number of commercial clients every year, and the sex workers are more likely to have a long-term cohabiting partner than the MSM. So this was actually a mathematical modelling study. I don't think we mentioned that in the title, but models are widely used to estimate the impact of different HIV interventions and to inform policy. So this model describes HIV transmission between MSM, sex workers, commercial clients, and lower risk members of the general population. We include some transmission directly between MSM and sex workers because some of the MSM in our sample do report buying sex from sex workers in Bangalore. So the model has a number of inputs. So firstly, a large number of behavioural inputs, and this data all came from surveys in Bangalore on who their sexual partners were, how often they were having sex, condom use, and so on. There's also a number of biological inputs, which we estimated from the literature. So things like the probability of acquiring HIV infection per sex act, and the efficacy of condoms and antiretroviral drugs to reduce transmission. So the next stage was to fit the model to data, and in non-jargon terms, that means varying the model inputs until the model outputs match the field data that we had. And the particular data that we were matching the model outputs to were, first of all, HIV prevalence for the MSM, the sex workers, and the clients. So the graph on the right shows the sort of 3 diamonds with the confidence intervals, the data that we had on prevalence from 3 different time points for sex workers in Bangalore. And we also fitted the model to data on overall coverage of antiretroviral therapy. So the model inputs were sampled many times using a technique called Latin hypercube sampling. And then we only retained those combinations of inputs which gave outputs agreeing with the data, and then used those for further analysis. So the graph also shows the range of HIV prevalence for those model inputs which agree with the data, so they all fall within those data ranges. So having got a model which reproduces the HIV prevalence and the ART coverage in Bangalore, we then use this to estimate the impact of PrEP. And we're defining impact here as the number of infections averted over 10 years for a PrEP intervention starting in January 2014. And we assume that there's some dropout. We're assuming 20% annual dropout from PrEP. We looked at a number of different PrEP intervention characteristics. So firstly, targeting PrEP to either the sex workers or to the MSM, the high-risk MSM, or to both groups. We looked at effectiveness, which is a combined measure of efficacy and adherence. So we assumed that was either 30 or 60%. So 30% assumes that quite a low adherence scenario. And then we looked at different coverage levels. So after 5 years, we assumed that either 20, 40, or 60% of the target group had been reached with PrEP. So the results firstly amongst the group being given PrEP. So I'm showing here the results for sex workers. So if PrEP is given to sex workers, we're looking at what impact it could have amongst them. So the graph shows the percentage of infections averted over 10 years. The dark purple bars on the left are if we assume a lower effectiveness scenario, and the lighter purple on the right if we assume a higher effectiveness. And going from left to right, for each of those, we're assuming increasing coverage. And the result that's just ringed in red there shows 40% coverage of the sex worker population. If we assume 60% effectiveness, then we estimate about 23% of infections amongst sex workers could be prevented over the next 10 years. And we see a higher impact if we assume a higher coverage or a higher effectiveness. And we see very similar results for MSM. If we target the high-risk MSM, we see very similar impact amongst the MSM themselves. We're also interested in knowing what the wider impact is in the whole population. So again, assuming a 40% coverage of sex workers with a 60% effectiveness of PrEP, we estimate about 3.5% of infections in the whole population of Bangalore could be averted over the next 10 years, and there's some uncertainty in that, of course. And the graph on the right here shows the percentage of infections averted in the whole population over 10 years, with the sex workers, if we're targeting sex workers in the middle, and then on the left if we just target the higher risk MSM, and then on the far right if we target both groups together. And we see that targeting MSM at 40% coverage has a lower level at the whole population level impact, although it had a similar impact amongst the MSM. And if we target both groups together, then the impact is almost additive. So that bar on the right is almost as tall as the other two bars stacked up. And this impact increases substantially over time. So if we ran the intervention for 20 years, we'd see a larger impact. So this graph just breaks down a bit where those HIV infections are being prevented. So this is actually showing the total number of infections averted over 10 years for that same PrEP scenario, with the same targeting. So on the left, if we're just targeting the high-risk MSM, in the middle, the sex workers, and on the right, both groups together. And you can see that, so it's breaking it down into which groups those are averted amongst. The sort of light purple bar at the top is showing infections prevented in the general population, so not amongst the high-risk groups. And you can see that when we target the sex workers, then there are more infections being averted in the general population than if we target the MSM. And again, if the intervention goes on for a longer period, then we see a greater proportion of infections being prevented amongst the general population as well as amongst the high-risk groups. A second question that we wanted to ask was, how efficient is it to provide PrEP for sex workers or MSM in this setting? We're defining efficiency as the person years of PrEP given per life year gained in the whole population. So this graph shows that. So the person years of PrEP per life year gained over 10 years, again with 40% coverage of the target group and 60% PrEP effectiveness. From left to right, if we just target the high-risk MSM, in the middle the sex workers, on the right both groups. And this time, so if greater efficiency is a smaller bar, because you're giving less less PrEP per extra year of life gained. And we can see that now it's most efficient to target sex workers only, followed by targeting both groups together rather than just the MSM. And if we look over, instead of over a 10-year time horizon, if we look over a 20-year time horizon, then the efficiency is vastly improved. So now you get much greater survival gains per person year on PrEP. But still, again, we're seeing it's most efficient to give it to sex workers, followed by giving it to both groups. So just conclusions from this study so far. So in answer to our first question, what could be the additional impact of providing PrEP for sex workers or MSM in this setting? That we could see a substantial reduction in incidence amongst the group that is given PrEP, and a smaller reduction in incidence in the whole population, and that we'd see a larger impact at the whole population level if we targeted sex workers rather than MSM. And the question of efficiency, how efficient is it to provide PrEP for these populations? We saw it was more efficient to target sex workers or to target both groups together rather than to just target MSM. We see much greater efficiency in the longer term, so I think implications for how long you think about your intervention and the impact it has. And the next bit of analysis that we'd really like to do is to see whether we could achieve higher efficiency if we targeted PrEP to the subgroup of sex workers who report that they're unable to use condoms consistently rather than giving it to all sex workers. And so I'd just like to finish by thanking my co-authors and colleagues, both in the UK and in India, and to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for funding, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. We're running a little bit over time, so we haven't got perhaps one question. Has anyone got a question? Yeah. Okay, yes, Mike 7. Sorry, it's really hard to see from down here. It's kind of like rabbits in the headlight.
Okay. Hi, I'm Joanna. I'm from New South Wales. I just wanted to know that where PrEP is provided to sex workers, can you ensure that this will be voluntary, that it will be with fully informed consent, that it will not be at the expense of community-led programs which we already know work, and how are you involving sex workers in this process?
Okay, great. So this work done as part of demonstration projects that are being planned currently in Mysore and Calcutta. So those are working with existing, so the Sonagachi intervention and the Avahan intervention in Mysore, which are very much peer educator led programs, and PrEP will be delivered through these programs. So it very much on top of their existing services, condom promotion and STI testing and so on. And I'm very sure it will be voluntary. I don't think it will be mandatory for them.
Okay, thank you.